Hi, everyone. This is the acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology, and this is your overview for the month of April. I am going to give you a look at all the biggest transits of the month of April 2020 in this video, and there's a lot to talk about. I've been getting a lot of funny jokes from people being like, well, we're all stuck at home, so what, how diverse could the astrology really be? And the answer is still really diverse. So we're going to take a look at everything that's coming up in April. Certainly, it's going to be a busy month in terms of like global collective headlines when you're looking at astrology from a mundane perspective. In a time like the time that we're living in right now, these mundane transits are going to offer a lot to us. They're really speaking very loudly. Now, I'm going to break down the first, like literally the first 7 days of the month are just packed. So let me show you what's going on. I'm just going to kind of break it down one transit at a time. And I'm going to actually start with Mercury's conjunction to Neptune. So at the very beginning of the month, you can see there's Mercury in a conjunction with the planet Neptune at the very start of the month. And this transit is going to perfect between the 1st and the 6th of the month. So you can see if I just progress this forward a little bit, there's the 4th. By the 6th, Mercury is well outside of that 3-degree range. But at the 1st of the month, Mercury is about 3 degrees off. And by the 6th, it's about 3 degrees off. So you give it that kind of 3 degrees on either side. April 1st to 6th, Mercury is conjoined with Neptune. What to expect? Well, this is a Mercury that we've been dealing with for a long time in the sign of Pisces, a watery sign. That's a sign that Mercury is both in its exile in or detriment, as well as fall. So we had a Mercury retrograde, and then Mercury came out of the retrograde and stationed in Aquarius in this last month of March, and then moves forward again, and now is coming back through Pisces one final time, which we will see the end of this month. But on its way, it's conjoined with Neptune. Now, there's basically two sides to this transit. First of all, with Mercury really debilitated, this can really just jack mercurial things up a whole lot, confuse, obfuscate, and make sort of messy mercurial things. Speech, information, technology, ideas, learning, communication dynamics in relationships. Sometimes things that are involving, the wiring in your house. Or I had, interestingly, last year when Mercury was retrograde in Pisces, and went through the conjunction with Neptune, we had to replace some part on the little hot tub that we have. When we bought the house, the previous owners had put a hot tub in on the deck, and it's just a little thing, but it was, my wife and I sometimes use it, and like it was working fine, and then Mercury goes retrograde in a water sign, and suddenly we had to fix some part, and the actual realization that we had to get this part replaced and replacing it all came while Mercury was conjoined with Neptune. So sometimes you'll see technology issues, tech stuff that's sort of on the fritz. Otherwise, Mercury and Neptune can be classic for gossip, disinformation, fake news, anything where there's an element of deception or illusion in the mind, communication, or the intellect. Not great significations. That would be the worst of it. The other side of it is that Mercury's conjunction to Neptune can bring an almost otherworldly level of insight, information, and ideas, symbols, images, and messages and dreams. So you have the planet of communication, the planet Hermes, Mercury, who is known as the messenger, conjoining with the great mystic Neptune. And so for that reason, I'm still getting over a cold, I apologize. And so for that reason, Mercury's conjunction to Neptune can also be truly sort of spiritually intense. There's often a lot of synchronicities that happen under Mercury-Neptune dynamics. You also have to be careful of the psychosomatic effect. As you think, so shall it be. That saying is sometimes just really annoying, but other times it's really real. It's really true. Mercury's conjunction to Neptune could mean that for a bit here at the beginning of the month, that our mind and our thoughts are a little bit more porous and can influence the environment or be influenced by others. So boundaries around communication, the mind and the intellect and so forth. It can also be almost like channeling something where there, stream of consciousness writing, something that's again just connected to the let's say the subliminal or the subtle or something that's transcendent, and it's just coming through Mercury, coming through the mind, the voice, the speech, and so forth. But don't forget that there are people who will love to claim that that's what they're tapping into, even though they're tapping into garden variety, narcissistic like delusions. So you do have to kind of, and ourselves too. We can do that to ourselves sometimes. So watch for that the 1st through the 6th of the month. Now, between the 1st and the 6th, there's another transit that's happening, which is also Mars conjoining with Saturn. Now, why am I taking it all the way up to the 6th? Because you can see at the very beginning of the month that Mars is already past Saturn. Well, the reason that I am taking it up to the 6th is because within that time frame, you're going to get about a 3-degree distance of separation. And we always look at planets when they're within 3 and separating from 3, especially slower moving planets. So from the 1st to the 6th of the month, we're still going to be feeling the Mars-Saturn conjunction, which I talked about in last month's monthly overview. What does that mean? Well, on the positive side of things, this is in a lofty air sign that is often known for pretty big thinking and can be quite broad-minded and sort of serious and structured all at once. So the broad-mindedness is the air, right? It can be very big thinking, Aquarius can. And then the structure comes from Saturn, and the potential for there to be something that is progressive or even visionary is part of Aquarius's MO in general. Saturn in Aquarius loves to look at the status quo and loves to look at what's beyond or outside of the city walls, so to speak. And sometimes there can be really intense dichotomies between what's kept in and what's held at check outside. Mars Saturn is a very good image in this case of like, martial law, martial being Mars and law, military, and Saturn being the law or the structure, the boundary. So intensification of social distancing at the beginning of the month, probably par for the course with Pluto conjoining Jupiter at the beginning, or Jupiter conjoining Pluto at the beginning of the month, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it can also pertain to progression or advancement in our thinking, seeing the big picture, even if it's sobering, knowing what we have to do, and putting ourselves into a concentrated state of hard work in order to achieve something that's represents the next big idea. You probably see coalitions of people working together to fix problems or to come up with solutions, to address systematic issues and come up with solutions. Mars and Saturn together are a bit like a pressure cooker. They are turning the coal into the diamond. Is that what turns into a diamond, is coal? I think it is. So it's the pressure needed to create something. That's Mars Saturn. If you've ever had a deadline for like a paper in college or school or something like that, a deadline at work, and you've procrastinated and all of a sudden you have a week to do it, and then suddenly you just go into this total zone of focus for like 3 days or 4 days straight, cramming as they call it. That's Mars, the effort, and Saturn, the discipline and the structure and the pressure put together can be very productive, but also can be very intense and sort of severe. And it can also represent potentially rigid and militaristic thinking and dogmatic and fundamentalist thinking. Why is it that it could be both broad and progressive and yet, strict and fundamentalist or overly conservative in some way? Well, the reason for that is that when you have you're dealing with Saturn, you're dealing with a planet that likes to work with oppositions, oppositional tension, Saturn being the lord of opposition. And so Saturn will be especially interested in what's on the outside versus what the status quo is. And you're going to see people falling on two sides of that. Saturn Mars is going to be fighting to maintain control and enforce the status quo. Or Mars Saturn can be like a pressure cooker that's about concentration, work, and effort to develop or cultivate, crystallize something that represents a departure from norms. That's why you can have Mars Saturn showing up as a punk rocker in Aquarius, or Mars Saturn showing up as somewhat dogmatic militarism or authoritarianism, or even totalitarian or fascism. It can be either, which is it's a funny part. And usually you're going to see which one it's going to be based on what else is happening. One of the things that's happening this month, when we move along a little bit more, by the 7th of the month, Mars is going to square Uranus. And Uranus is very much the avant-garde, the revolutionary, the progressive, the visionary, the outside of the box, and can be very disruptive and defiant. So the Saturn-Uranus square that we're dealing with, which will be very acute all of next year as well, that square also represents something about the moment that we're living in right now, where, for example, there are potentially breakthroughs happening in political and social thinking all around the world. We're seeing how global of a community we really are. And so innovation in terms of better, more community-friendly programs and systems of government and sharing in world supplies and the global marketplace. Like, a lot of ideas can be born in the pressure cooker of the beginning of this month. But the other thing that is also true is that when Saturn squares Uranus or opposes Uranus, or generally speaking, we get also a kind of conservative backlash. For example, I saw an article that was, I don't remember where it was, but it was basically saying how it's a strange thing, the way that a phenomenon like the coronavirus could stimulate both progressive, almost socialist policies. For example, a more universal understanding of healthcare that is probably more appealing to people now than it ever has been in certain places in the world. At the same time, you have the backlash of countries or nations perhaps becoming more decidedly authoritarian, or totalitarian, so to speak. I don't want to get too, like, blow it out too much, but it's true that there can be an impulse to want to control, lock down, and cut off and isolate when stuff like this happens politically and socially as well. Not just social distancing now. I'm talking about the way that these moments shape future generations and even the next couple of years in terms of the way that the global community is getting along with one another. So it's a weird time where there's both this potential for real progress environmentally in terms of healthcare, lots of things that people might be waking up to, while at the exact same time there might be a competing desire to become more conservative, to lock down and to separate even more, sometimes out of fear, and in other ways because there's like different kinds of technology that might be starting to be implemented as a way of trying to protect or defend from this happening again. But while that might be good, people may also be questioning how much control a government should really have over the population. You see what I'm saying? So, and I'm not a political expert, so please, I won't get involved in the debates and everything like that. It's not my thing. So, but you can tell that the beginning of this month, the Saturn Mars conjunction and then the square to Uranus is really, really important. Now, you may be experiencing these things in your personal life as well. The push between rebellious instincts and conservative instincts in any area of life. Just watch for that, and watch especially for some very explosive, volatile Mars energy in the more rebellious, defiant, potentially reckless category between the 1st and the 7th, when Mars not only conjoins Saturn, but then squares Uranus. So that's another, and that's just between the 1st and the 7th, really. Now, between the 1st and the 15th, the other major thing that's happening, is, if that's not already enough with Mars and Saturn, and Mercury and Neptune, is that Jupiter is conjoining with Pluto. And that you've heard me give a lot of talks about that already. A couple, go back into my archives, watch the Jupiter Pluto video that I made. But that is exact right around the 4th to the 5th. And it's present from the 1st of the month, closing in about 20 minutes off from exact. And then it switches, Jupiter does, to 25 degrees by the 5th into the 6th. So the first 7 days of April are also defined by the Jupiter Pluto dynamic. And that has to do with the proliferation, abundance, growth, and expansion, Jupiter, of Plutonian qualities, or that Jupiterian influence being just detonated by a Plutonian, a Plutonian bomb. Let's call it, because Pluto's pretty nuclear. It's like some little small things, or things that are very invisible and that you don't see, that sometimes come erupting out of nowhere. And typically it's because another planet is triggering it, just like Saturn Pluto did earlier in January. Now we're dealing with everything that we're dealing with. Jupiter Pluto's dynamic is very similar in that it's going to be triggering or detonating Plutonian events. One would think about the rapid or widespread proliferation of this coronavirus as very obvious low-hanging fruit, but watch for it in your personal life as well. Look at the whole sign house of Capricorn in your chart and think about the growth and expansion of things that are deep. Perhaps deep means good. Perhaps deep means life-changing and transformative and expansive all at once. On the other hand, don't be surprised if you have to look at things in a very deep way, and if you have wisdom kind of coming through because of exposure to things that you haven't been seeing or that have been relatively unconscious. So that's Pluto Jupiter. Now that's really active all the way through basically the 15th of the month. It's pretty action packed. All right, so let's talk about a little bit of lighter news, which is that Venus is going to enter. Here we go. Right around on the 2nd into the 3rd, Venus will enter Gemini. Now, Venus is losing dignity from leaving Taurus, so I don't mean to be like, oh my gosh, this is the best transit ever. But the thing that is nice about this initially is that Venus hits the trine to Saturn and is not going to perfect the trine to Mars, but it's definitely influencing Mars, or picking up, putting some of her grace into the Saturn-Mars energy. That's nice because anytime you get a benefic that's not so totally jacked up like Jupiter is right now, lending it, its beneficence to the two nasty ones, the two malefics, like that's not a bad thing. That happens very briefly at the beginning of the month as Venus just enters Gemini and trines Saturn. Some of the simple things you can look for are going to be something that is intelligent, social, intellectual. It's Venus in Gemini is good for business, with Venus in a Mercury ruled sign. It hits Saturn by a trine, so that's a productive Jupiterian-like connection. And that can mean that agreements or coalitions are being made, or that some form of allegiance and friendships are being developed. It can also mean that something beautiful is being made or built. It can mean that there is some form or structure that's being built that's going to create more ease or flow or fluidity. It can mean that there is a depth and a seriousness and a maturity present in relationships and communication that's also productive. Venus trine to Saturn can also mean that relationships are deepening, romantic connections are deepening and growing wiser. Venus trine to Saturn can also mean that there is some comic relief. Venus-Saturn combinations, in my book, always lead to like the ability to find humor in something that's kind of stark or grave or serious, but being able to find humor in it. Especially Venus in Gemini is quite clever. Venus trine Saturn can also mean that there is something that's starting to happen that is more online or sort of internet-based. The reason for that is that Venus is in Mercury's sign. We do have to be careful because, remember, Mercury's with Neptune at the start of the month when Venus is making this trine to Saturn, and so that can be there could be some be careful about deception, potentially the illusory energy being around in some way. I would be careful about some kind of proud, overly confident proclamation being made around this time, or of disinformation or sort of misleading information. But again, generally speaking, Mercury and Neptune's positive side of this, again, Mercury being the dispositor of Venus and Gemini, will be to lend some kind of synchronistic, otherworldly, miraculous, uplifting, healing quality, especially in relationship to the mind, communication, speech, information, um, things of that nature. So there's some grace and some grace and ease and good fortune sort of flowing through potentially that might be kind of, kind of miraculous, actually, if you go to the most positive side of this. And at the worst, again, it might be something that is getting overly confident about something that's sort of an illusion. So yeah, it's a big, like I said, it's quite a picture. Now, what happens after this for Venus is not necessarily great. Lots of astrologers have probably, who are into Hellenistic astrology, have probably heard of this concept, but I'm just going to illustrate it for you by quickly taking out everything in the chart except for, we're going to keep leaving Venus, we're going to leave in Mars, and we're going to leave in Saturn. So check this out. Right around the 5th, right about that time, a little bit earlier than that, even like the 4th, Venus is going to enter what's called a malefic enclosure. So here's Venus in Gemini. And notice now that Saturn's ray at 0 degrees casts to 0 Gemini behind Venus. And Mars's ray at 4 casts in front of Venus at 4 Gemini. So in other words, Venus is sandwiched between the rays of the malefics flowing into 0 Gemini and 4 Gemini. And this condition is going to pretty much stay for the rest of the month, because watch what happens as the month goes on. Venus is preparing to turn retrograde. That'll happen by the middle of May, but Venus is going to turn retrograde in Gemini, which means Venus is going to start to slow down. So even though typically Venus would catch Mars because Venus is the faster planet, Venus is going to stay sandwiched between them. Notice how Mars just keeps moving faster. That's because Venus is actually slowing down. So you're hoping that Venus will break out of the containment, but no, Venus is stuck. Now, what does this mean? You can see it again. Here's Saturn at 1 on that side of Venus. Here's Mars at 16 on the other side. We don't have any planets breaking up this enclosure. So Venus is sandwiched between the rays of the malefics. Now, these are trines from the malefics. That does mean that progress is capable, that the malefics can in some way be helping Venus, that Venus can be doing some good in the world, so to speak, but is doing so within confinement. And isn't that the picture of the world right now? So in terms of our social lives, probably doesn't look good for getting out, in April, Venus being our social life, let's say, confined by the malefics, not a pretty picture. But it would be not surprising to see Venus doing things that are very productive in isolation or in confinement, because these are trine rays, and that's not the worst thing in the world. So some form of social productivity, of learning, of exchange, of ideas, even commerce and doing business, inventiveness. Venus and Gemini is very inventive, but doing so within the confines and pressures and limitations and frustrations of Saturn and Mars. And that's pretty much Venus's MO for the month. And later in the month, Venus will almost square Neptune by April 30th. And so the very end of the month, and into next month, as Venus is getting ready to retrograde, Venus will do so in a pretty tight square to Neptune. Did I say Uranus? I meant Neptune if I said Uranus. Venus will square Neptune by the end of the month. And then in middle of May, when Venus finally turns retrograde in Gemini, there'll be a square to Neptune as well. So Venus also becomes kind of otherworldly in the mix of all of this, which we'll take a look at next month. But for now, just knowing that Venus, the goddess of love, pleasure, joy, beauty, friendship, harmony, in very inventive, communicative, stimulated, and sometimes technological Gemini is being contained by the malefics this month. Not a great picture for social life and for Venusian things, but it is promising in terms of being able to work maybe productively within some kind of parameters or limitations, because again, these are trines. So, okay, now on April 7th, as if that's not enough, right? I mean, isn't that crazy that all of that's happening right away and I'm adding more? So on April 7th, if we back up a little bit, now I'm going to add in the whole rest of everyone else is like, hey guys, come on, there's a whole bunch of us. So let's put everyone back in, get the nodes in here, the whole gang. Now, how about on April 7th, a full moon to boot? Like let's just throw a full moon in there. So you get the full moon in Libra coming through. Now that full moon in Libra is in Venus's sign, is in a trine with Venus. So again, you're looking at probably a nice Venusian energy around the full moon, if not for the fact that Venus is enclosed by the malefics. That's what we're dealing with. But it could be that, again, the idea of harmony, grace, fairness, balance, ethics, law, truth, justice, equality, and harmony are emphasized right around April 7th. And something nice is happening, but it's happening within some kind of limiting and potentially frustrating parameters with Venus enclosed. This could be also the feeling of finding some kind of sweet spot within the difficulty, a silver lining that's coming through, a glimmer of hope, even though, there's still a row to hoe. So that the feeling of that comes from a full moon in Venus's sign, which is good, uplifting, beautiful, intelligent in Libra, air sign. But again, and Venus is in a trine with the moon, so that's good. But then Venus is sitting between those malefic rays. So see how that plays out in personal life. So hard for me to make this personal this month, by the way, because all that's on my mind lately has been, what's happening in the collective in some ways. But to make it more personal, again, you're looking for Venus as a harmonizing influence around the full moon that should bring in helpful, beneficial qualities, or will emphasize the need for them against polarity with the sun in Aries, exalted sun in Aries, with Mars-like qualities, which are more militant or rigid or fear-based or action-oriented. This is like a cool breeze. So it is interesting that at the same time as the full moon, I don't want to like oversell how wonderful it's going to be too much, because on that same day, we've got Mars in the square to Uranus. So, there on that day, there's kind of this electrical Mars Uranus energy that could be quite forceful, aggressive, and revolutionary. So I've got to just feel good that the moon is tempering it with some Venus energy. I mean, that at least that's kind of a silver lining. All right. Well, anyway, let's go on. So now if we go up to like the 19th of the month, that's when kind of have a lull again, although sun, like all the way up until about the 13th to 15th, you have a little bit of a lull. Jupiter and Pluto are not really a lull, but given everything else that's going on in the month, it cools down a bit after the 7th until like the 13th to the 15th. During this period, what we're going to see is the sun in Aries going through squares to Pluto and Jupiter in Capricorn. So you can see that right here. And where the sun, the sun in Aries hits the square to Pluto, you see the potential for real demonstrations of power and force from people in power or leadership, or you see potential corruption, scandal, death, and the underworld, and kind of these heavy Plutonian themes involved with fathers, involved with leaders, involved with heads of state or CEOs, or you see great, powerful demonstrations of ego amplified by Jupiter, made bigger, which could be sort of corrupt or dark or heavy-handed in some way. At the same time, this is an energy of heroism, of moral determination and courage, and of potentially some moment of clarity and wisdom and truth, sort of surging through. Did you ever see Lord of the Rings? I some of my favorite movies of all times. I think it's in the second one in the Two Towers when Gandalf arrives with the riders at the battle, the great battle of Helm's Deep, if I remember correctly, that's happening. And the sun comes and he comes riding down and lays waste to the enemy, right? So this idea of there being kind of like a heroic surge of light and energy right around the middle of the month is promising. For all of us in our lives, you could see this playing out in a variety of different ways, just more action, rising to a challenge, feeling determined, having a clarity and breakthroughs of understanding. Many people right now are essentially, this is a kind of psychological initiation for a huge amount of people on our planet who are so dialed into the status quo and the media and everything else like that, that something like this can deeply transform a person. I would look for some of that with the Sun square Pluto and Jupiter, just almost like a return of one's moral courage and one's understanding of what truth is. That's the Sun is connected to all of those topics. But you could also see the kind of heavy-handedness of the ego. Jupiter, Pluto, Sun dynamic can be kind of ruthless and egomaniacal. So that's the dark side of it. Now, that's from the 13th to the 15th. If you take the Sun forward a little bit, then the Sun's going to start doing something that is a lot of planets going to end up doing, which is working through the, like Mercury is going to do this too. And then the new moon, going to work through those squares in late Capricorn to Pluto and Jupiter, and then go right into a square with Saturn in early Aquarius. So the Sun-Saturn square has more of the feeling of the heavy is the head that wears the crown. It's more about, it has the same kind of courageous, light, hopeful leadership, action-oriented qualities with moral courage involved. But it's heading through square to Saturn, which is limitation, constraint, heaviness, sobriety, seriousness, old age, death, etc. So we're going through this period of, some real waves with the Sun, waves of darkness and resilience and perseverance and like that. The Sun square Saturn can also be about a great work, the focusing and narrowing of one's efforts and actions, Sun to Saturn. You can also see issues around authority and responsibility and duty and even challenges to authority. And also feeling constricted or limited in the expression of our ego and our will in the world, but also potentially refining and growing up and kind of becoming more mature. So these Sun-Saturn energies are really quite intense right around the 19th. And as if that's not enough, then on the 22nd, like I said, this month is just bananas. On the 22nd, then we have a new moon. And this new moon is packing a punch because it's conjoined with Uranus. And it's not only conjoined with Uranus, but it is square to Saturn. So we could double up on everything we just said about the Sun square Saturn, but this also indicates that the entire lunar cycle ahead, which starts in late April and goes into later on in May, is going to be toned by basically the Saturn-Uranus dynamic that I spoke about earlier. That is the impulse toward revolutionary changes that break the status quo, that are progressive and inventive, but possibly disruptive and shocking, and defiant. Technologically, you can also see a lot of breakthroughs and sort of bold new visions of the future. And then meeting with Saturn, which is limitation, constraint, conservative tendencies, to the need to structure, refine, shape, discipline, ground, tighten, conserve. So those impulses are really battling back and forth between late April and late May. And we're probably going to see that in the collective. You also have to be careful when you look at it like this, because this can be sort of the unstoppable force in the immovable object scenario that we can get into in our own heads and hearts. We may feel like we really want to do something, or we may, feel very passionate about something and feel like we need to move the ball down the field in some direction in our lives, even from within the privacy of our own home, seriously. And yet there is the question about how to do it, how to structure it, how to integrate it, how to make sure it's grounded, how to make sure it's disciplined and focused. Saturn will sort of hold our most rebellious and innovative tendencies into check with the need to be grounded and sober. On the other hand, this can be about revolutionary changes that just need to find the right structure and form, and that the pressure is there to get the work done this next lunar cycle. So those are a few things to watch for given the lunar cycle at the end of the month. If you want to see where those tensions are happening personally, look at your whole sign house of Taurus and your whole sign house of Aquarius in your birth chart. So, can give you a little bit more information then. All right. So then when we go from the 24th to the 27th, Mercury is going to go through the same exact motion that the sun went through. You're going to see Mercury in late Aries, which I will take over being in Pisces any longer. So sorry to anyone who has Mercury in Pisces. So Mercury is square to Pluto and square to Jupiter, right around the 24th to the 26th. And then by the 27th is going to go right into the square with Saturn. So you've got just a whole ball of energy being thrown at this little stellium from Mercury. What does that mean? Well, if Mercury is the mind and Mercury is in Mars's sign, then you're going to have innovation. You're going to have people being more outspoken, more aggressive or assertive, potentially a little bit more anxious, impatient, but also heroic in mind and thought and speech, and innovative in thought and mind and speech and action. These are good Mercury and Aries qualities. Hitting Pluto and Jupiter, this could be a moment of breakthrough around communication, speech, learning, important messages that are coming through that broaden the mind, that expand upon something, or that reveal something that's been hidden from view. So really important revelations, disclosure of hidden information, potentially around this time with Mercury square Pluto. And then going through Jupiter, there's an expansive element to this. And then it hits Saturn, where it hits a contraction right away again. Just crazy. And then right after the contraction, what is it going to do? Well, by the 30th of the month, watch this. Okay, so just imagine this. It hits Pluto, right? Right about this time, April 24th. You get this deep, intense, subterranean, explosive energy between Mercury, let's just call it mind Mercury, and Pluto. Then you get expansive Jupiter. Granted, it's in its fall, right? But it's still like expansive Jupiter. And then it goes on to the brake pedal Saturn, right? The contractive energy of Saturn, more formal, a little bit more rigid, potentially very serious, good at organizing, good at, structuring things mentally. But then where does it go? Well, it's going to go over that new moon point. And then by the 30th of the month, it hits a conjunction to wild, erratic, revolutionary, forward-thinking Uranus. Like, what a sequence from Mercury to end the month, right? So our minds, our speech, our ideas, communication are going to be really sort of all over the map between, say, the 24th, 24th and the 30th. The last week is like a Mercury explosion. That bodes really well for people who have some practices in place to make sure that you're not overstimulating your mind. Like, don't be drinking caffeine, coffee, sugar, stuff that just like bombards your mind with really intense thoughts, ideas, energy, and the motion or speed in your mind is like too fast. Be really careful about that toward the end of this month. But at the same time, don't be surprised if you're being really inspired mentally, if communication in your life is very dynamic, could be intense. You want to be careful because there's a bit of a gas break gas dynamic at the end of the month. So, if you see that coming, one of the things that it could easily indicate would be some kind of mental or communicative overconfidence that eventually has to be checked and then maybe flies forward again. But knowing that that's there, just temper, be careful with the way that you react to things, and be careful with the way that you're sort of managing words and thoughts toward the end of the month. All right. So another thing that's interesting that's happening on April 29th at the very end of the month is we have a Mars-Sun contra Anticia. I'll just illustrate this for you. So here's Mars at 10 Taurus. Here's the contra Anticia, or here's Sun at 10 Taurus. Here's Mars at 20 Aquarius. That is a contra Anticia, which is kind of like a secretive form of opposition. So Sun-Mars opposition could mean that there are challenges to authority, or that you have a very combative kind of ego tendency in the air goes along nicely with Mercury going into a conjunction with Uranus, really defiant, challenge the status quo, challenge authority. That comes through right at the very end of the month as well. So the Mars Sun contra Antisha has this very willful, aggressive, combative, and defiant energy behind it, especially around authorities or the way that we wield our, the ego. And then Mercury is conjoining with Uranus, which can be very inventive. I mean, it can be just breakthrough ideas, breakthroughs in understanding, but also has a tendency to be quite rebellious. So that energy stands out at the end of the month. So that is what we're looking at as the breakdown of the month. I hope that you will track this out, come back to the video, come back to those transits, track them in your life, tell me what's happening. I love hearing your stories in the comments section. I like hearing how you guys are experiencing each of the transits as they unfold. If any of them particularly stands out and you have some stories about how you're experiencing it from within a social distancing situation, that would be especially interesting to hear. Why? Because isn't it interesting to think that in some ways the set is sort of the same for all of us right now. In a lot of ways, we're all at home. So I'd love to hear how these energies, not just in the collective, but how they end up manifesting in your private life. It's been harder for me to talk about it this month in some ways because I'm trying to imagine how they can play out within a person's life when they're more confined. So it's kind of an experiment in that regard that I'd love your help with. Tell me how these energies that we've talked about, how you see them play out between the first and the end of the month. Please come back and re-listen to the video, track it along with me, share your stories. I think we can all stand to learn a lot about astrology and a lot about these symbols by doing that with one another. So I hope you will. In the meantime, I want to remind all of you that my new Bhakti Yoga channel has launched. If you want access to it, you can visit my website, nightlightastrology.com, and you'll see a Bhakti tab. When you click on that, you can get easy access to a whole private YouTube channel of Bhakti content that I've created. I hope that you will check that out. I think that you'll enjoy it. Those of you who enjoy the way that I sprinkle yoga philosophy into the way that I teach many transits and planetary aspects and so forth will probably really enjoy this channel. So you can check that out. And don't forget that I am now enrolling for all of my classes, my Year 1 Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic course, my Year 2 course, and my Horary Astrology course, which you can also learn more about on the website. Need-based tuition is open for anyone who is struggling with the coronavirus. If that's a constraint on your budget, please use the need-based tuition if you want to study. I would love to have you. And that's what I've got for this month. So I hope you have a very nice month of April, and I look forward to connecting with you for your sun and rising sign horoscopes. I'm going to be doing Saturn part 2 in Aquarius, Saturn square Uranus, more to say about that transit as well. So lots more to come. And I look forward to sharing more of this crazy world experience that we're all going through right now with all of you. Okay, take care.